When you think of witches, is this what you see? As a little girl, like so many little girls, I wanted to be a witch. On grey winter days, I heard their songs in the woods. At night, they danced in my dreams. I longed to join their secret rituals. I brewed potions from flowers and herbs, wrote spell books that I hid under my pillow. And I chanted my desires over and over again, trying to make something, anything happen in my quiet little world. I read books about witches. I saw them on TV. But most of all, I watched them at the cinema.
Girls, watch out for those weirdos.
We are the weirdos, mister.
I still remember seeing The Wizard of Oz for the first time. From the moment Dorothy stepped into that Technicolor land, I was spellbound. The Wizard of Oz showed me that there are two types of witches. We have Glinda with her white magic, her sweet temperament, and her sparkling traditional beauty.
Are you a good witch or a bad witch?
I'm not a witch at all. Witches are old and ugly.
Only bad witches are ugly.
And we have the Wicked Witch of the West, whose sickly green skin and evil demeanor has become an indelible cultural image.
I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog, too.
I wanted to be a good witch. I couldn't understand why any woman would choose to be bad. I didn't know then what I know now, that being good or bad isn't a choice a woman gets to make for herself. The Wicked Witch was supposed to scare us, but she was also created as a warning for women and girls. Behave and be beautiful, or we will destroy you. Women have been taught this lesson for centuries, so that now it is embroidered onto our bones, mixed with our blood, tattooed onto our beating hearts. It is in our culture, in all our stories, women are pitted against each other. The virgin, the whore, the maiden, the crone, the good witch, and the bad witch. It is a narrative that is so successfully pervasive that we repeat it to each other. We police our sisters, our neighbors, our friends.
Slut. What did you say? You heard her. She's not wearing a bra.
This vicious narrative empowered those who are threatened by us to believe that their fear and hatred of women is correct, that they are right to persecute us. A few months after I watched The Wizard of Oz, I learned in school about the women who had been murdered in the witch trials that took place across Europe and America hundreds of years ago. Their stories haunted me. I became obsessed with them, carrying their names around with me like charms, reciting them to myself when I felt anxious or lonely. Anna Moats, Elizabeth Clark, Mary Scrotton, Catherine Grady, Mary Hicks, Isabella Rigby, Janet Horn, Ruth Osborne, Agnes Waterhouse, Elizabeth Davis, Anne Whittle, Jane Bulcock, Susanna Smith, Anna Moats. Some of those witches were healers and midwives, helping their communities with their skills. Others were outcasts, living on the edge of their village. And some of them had lost their minds. This resonated with me because I have always been stalked by the shadow of madness. As a child, I made deals with unknown forces, believing certain behaviors would keep me safe. At night, I would talk for hours to people who didn't exist. And I constructed worlds in my head that were so visceral, so solid and alive, that I wanted to stay in them forever. As I got older, I poured my madness into my work and found I was able to control it, even use it. And I said goodbye to the witches, letting them fade away into childhood. I was happy. I was safe. But that was just an illusion. 3 years ago, I gave birth to my son. Within a month, I was admitted to a psychiatric ward. The madness had found me again. And the witches? They were so close now I could feel their breath on the back of my neck. As I shuffled from room to room, I caught glimpses of them, felt their bony hands on me when I lay awake at night. They sung to me from the sea, called me into the woods, inviting me to join them. Until eventually, I did. I've always been scared to be ugly and messy, scared to show my wickedness and my weakness. But I don't care anymore. I need you to know how it feels to lose your mind completely. I want you to see what I saw, feel what I felt. So I'm going to drag you into this spell with me. Because while I survived, far too many have not. Pregnancy is a strange time, at once mundane yet wildly magical. And looking back, I can see that this was when the madness started crawling towards me. As my body rapidly transformed, the edges of reality began to blur. I no longer felt tied to the present, instead existing in some strange liminal space, connected to all the women throughout history who had made this journey before me. The doors to the past and the future were open, and I felt like I was walking between two worlds, asleep and awake. And no one had ever told me being pregnant could feel like this. Films had taught me I was supposed to be calm, pretty, soft, and pink.
What is it?
It moved.
What moved?
The baby, it moved.
But I didn't feel like that. I felt out of control. I was a storm, wild and unmoored. I was a fire. And because of that disconnection, I found pregnancy an anxious and lonely time. I counted down the days till it would be over. I couldn't wait to hold my son in my arms, to feel his warm body on my skin. After his birth, I was elated. I was on a high. I couldn't sleep because I didn't need to sleep. I was too excited, too mad with love. But then, everything started to go wrong. What follows is my testimony.
Thank you.
Okay, so my son was born on a Wednesday in a heat wave, And by the Sunday night, I was starting to feel very strange. I remember my husband was holding our baby and he asked me to take him just for a minute. And I couldn't. He was standing in the living room. And I remember I sort of started involuntarily backing away into the kitchen. I was just terrified. It was a fear that I have never known before. I wanted to run away. We drove to A&E at midnight, our son, tiny in his little car seat, and sat in this sticky, sweaty room while a doctor, I remember this really clearly because he had really red hair and then sort of bright blue scrubs. Dr. Ben, he was called. He started asking me a series of questions.
In the last week, how often have you been bothered by feeling down, depressed, or hopeless?
How often have you had little interest or pleasure in doing things?
How often have you been bothered by trouble falling or staying asleep or sleeping too much?
I would become very familiar with these questions over the next few months.
How often have you been bothered by feeling bad about yourself or that you are a failure or have let yourself or your family down?
After listening to me explain how I'd been feeling, Dr. Ben said it was a classic case of baby blues and that it would probably just go away on its own. I went home and tried to carry on. I tried to hide how I was feeling, but my mental health was deteriorating rapidly. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and I was starting to have thoughts of harming myself. One night, I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to walk out of our house and head for a nearby bridge that went over the motorway. I'd seen bunches of flowers there before, faded photographs with names written underneath. But I'd never been able to understand why anyone would climb onto the railings, why anyone would jump. But now it was taking all my strength not to run there. We called the hospital, and I remember the woman on the phone was so kind. She just kept saying, I know, it's awful. And she called me an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, I was sat on the sofa, and I think by this point I hadn't slept, for about 10 days. And I couldn't eat. I just physically couldn't swallow. It was 5 a.m, and I wanted to die. And one of the paramedics was this guy in his 50s or 60s. And he took one look at me, sat on the sofa, and he said, "Welcome to parenthood," like jazz hand. And I remember just thinking, really? This is normal? I'm supposed to feel like this? It's supposed to be like this? He was a very nice man. He came to see me later when I was in A&E to check up on me. But him saying that at that point in my illness really made me feel like there was something wrong with me, like I wasn't cut out for this, that I didn't possess the requisite skills to be a mother. And it kills me to say this, knowing what I know now and knowing how I feel about my son. But from then on, I really started to feel like I'd made a mistake becoming a parent, and that everyone knew and everyone could see it. Because we all know what a mother is supposed to be like. A good mother is selfless, her entire identity consumed by her love for her child. She is immaculate. She is youthful, innocent, almost virginal in her purity. Her hair flows behind her as she walks through a field of wildflowers, breastfeeding her baby. She always smells of freshly baked bread. She wears long cotton dresses and no makeup. She glows with love from within. She never questions her life. She feels eternally blessed and complete. She has at least 3 children for whom she is the primary caregiver. She is thin, attractive, and stylish. She is never stressed, never angry. She overflows with compassion, joy, and endless emotional resources. She is a mother and nothing else, and that is more than enough for her. And she is happy. I was now surrounded by perfect mothers. They were everywhere. I was nothing like them. I was more like the character of Marlowe in Tully, a film I'd seen before but which had new resonance when I watched it again at 4 a.m. while trying to breastfeed. I was shocked by how much of it felt deeply, troublingly relatable. Marlowe seems to be trapped in her life with a newborn, repeating the same 3 hours over and over again, losing more of herself as every second ticks by until she is just a ghost who has forgotten who she once was. Her old life gone forever. I had finally found a woman who looked, behaved, and felt like me. But her story didn't end well. And I was becoming increasingly suspicious that mine wouldn't either. As the sun came up, I went back to the emergency room. I was prescribed medication to help me sleep, and I did sleep, and I started formula feeding, which definitely helped. Although, also compounded my feelings of shame and guilt and that I wasn't an adequate mother. But that anxiety, that doom, just kept growing, and it was like this living, breathing terror. And we didn't know what to do. We didn't know what was wrong with me. And so it became even easier for me to think, right, everything in my life was fine. And then I had a baby, and now I'm in a horror film. So it must be because of the baby that I feel like that. At first, I was able to push those thoughts away. But the longer my illness went on, the harder it became to ignore the voice in my head that told me I was only in this situation because I had become a mother. My thoughts about my son became more sinister. Maybe if he wasn't here anymore, I wouldn't feel like this. Maybe that was what would finally end this torture. I was so desperate that I started to fear there was only one way to make that happen. I didn't tell anyone about these thoughts. They were too evil. No one would ever understand me, and no one would forgive me for thinking them. I knew what happened to women who hurt their children. I knew how society treated them. So I didn't dare tell anyone. Not even the doctors. Every day I would wake up with this dread, this doom. It was like being in excruciating pain, physical pain, and no one can do anything. There's nothing they can do to take it away. Well, they can prescribe you medication and they can refer you for therapy, but the counselling, the wait lists for counselling in the UK especially are so long, and the medication can take up to 4 weeks to work, if it works at all. It really was unbearable. Before I got ill, my only awareness of mental health conditions around childbirth came from films, where it's very much baby blues.
Due to changing hormones, over 80% of all women experience postpartum depression. Well, I'm not gonna.
There's a woman, and she's got milk vomit on her sweatshirt, and her hair's all a mess, and she can't stop crying, and she calls her mum and sobs down the phone for a bit.
There he is.
And then in the next scene, she's buying shoes or something. It really was like living in a horror film. My house, this home that had once felt completely safe, was now the scariest place in the world. It was visceral. I could taste the evil in my mouth. I know that sounds dramatic, but I don't really know how else to explain it. And it did feel like I was possessed. Like there were two versions of me. Good me.
I'm glad.
And bad me.
I can't exist by myself because I'm afraid of myself. Because I'm the maker of my own evil.
It's the strangest feeling to exist in your life, in your world, and all the pieces of it are still there. Your
home, your friends, your family, your partner, everything is still there. You can see it, you can touch it, but all of the colour and the joy has just drained away. And things you never ever thought would happen to you are happening. These once unimaginable scenes that are just unfolding around you, and you feel so powerless because there's no way for you to stop it. My friends, my family, my husband, they all did their best to support me. But increasingly I began to feel like I was a burden and that everyone would be better off without me, my son included. I thought that if I did die, if I did kill myself, they'd be sad, sure, but they'd probably also be like, oh, well, it's for the best. Yeah, it's for the best. I really, really believe that. I started thinking of ways I could do it. Not so much making plans, but definitely weighing up my options. And then I nearly stepped in front of a van, only stopping myself because I didn't want to do that to someone else. I was just scared to be alone. I was even more scared to be alone with my son because I didn't know what I might do to him.
By now, my brain was playing a constant loop of hideous scenes. I saw myself smothering our son with a pillow, dropping him from a window on the 3rd floor, drowning him in the bathtub. And yet I loved him more than I'd ever loved anyone or anything. At night, I checked constantly that he was still breathing, watching his little chest rise and fall. When he wasn't in my arms, I missed him so much, my heart ached. For the first time in my life, I realized I could hold the good and the bad in my heart at the same time. I could feel both at once. That was terrifying. I felt so alone.
Throughout this whole period, I was asking everyone I knew for help. I was posting on Twitter, which sometimes I regret posting on Twitter when I wasn't like completely in my right mind. But still, I was posting on Twitter. I was messaging all the parents I knew. I was talking to women I'd never met before on the phone about it. I just wanted someone to say, look, this is the way out. This is how you get out of this. And then a friend put me in touch with a WhatsApp group of women who'd had similar illnesses. And that just changed everything.
So my name's Shima Tariq, and I'm a doctor and researcher based at University College London, working in HIV, and I'm your friend.
Can you just remind me of how we first met?
So we met in summer of 2020, and you had just had Bertie. I think he was like, 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old?
Yeah.
And you joined this WhatsApp group, Motherly Love.
Can you just introduce yourself for me?
Of course. So my name is Millie, and I am a mum of 2, and I live in London. So Motherly Love is a peer support group for women who are struggling with motherhood and don't have a space to talk about the darker side of it. And we just started it as basically a cup of tea. Come and have a cup of tea and a biscuit with other women who don't feel that they belong within the normal baby group world.
They got it, and they took me seriously, and whatever fucked up thoughts I was having, someone else had had them too, and they'd got through it. They'd survived. They'd been there. It became this vital source of hope and support and just knowledge, which didn't seem to be accessible anywhere else.
No one talks about how hard it is. Someone will ask you how it's going, and you're expected to say, oh, it's great. I'm really happy. This baby is the centre of my world. And I didn't feel like that.
When I had our eldest, I was really unhappy in myself, but I loved being her mum. But what started to happen was I started to have maternal OCD, where I believed that I was going to hurt her. And it's such an uncomfortable thing to talk about, because every night I put her to bed, had these thoughts that I would sexually abuse my child. And saying those words out loud, I hardly ever say that to anybody, but it was the most frightening thing, and I never spoke to a single person about it. And I would self-harm because that was the only way to stop these thoughts. And I just lived with it. And it was just it was torture.
Why do you think people don't talk about that stuff? Why do you think it is so hidden?
People are scared. I think society is scared about engaging with these more difficult feelings around motherhood. We want to feel safe, don't we, with mothers? We like to think that mothers are the place of ultimate safety. And I think even when we're grown-ups, the idea that a mother might not like her child is actually deeply terrifying. It's a very primal fear about engaging with with that darker side.
I was so scared to be honest with anyone about what was really going on in my head. I thought they'd take my son away from me. But after Millie, Shima, and the other women in the group began to tell me about their own experiences, it allowed me to finally be honest. And they didn't judge me. Instead, they responded with love and compassion. They made me realize how serious my illness was, and that this was a situation which could have potentially tragic outcomes. So when I told them I was once again feeling suicidal, they sprang into action.
Do you remember that day that you came to my house?
Yeah, I do, very vividly, partly because my husband was worried. He was like, you're going to go and just meet a stranger who you know nothing about, who says that she's really, really struggling. And what are you going to do? I was like, I'm going to pick her up and drive her to A&E. I was worried about you. I mean, I'd been worried about you for a few weeks, actually. And I was anxious about whether you'd get taken seriously. So I remember in that drive almost trying to coach you, because I just wanted you to get the help that I thought you needed.
At the door to the hospital, Shima said to me, "You need to tell them everything." And there was an understanding between us of what that meant. She told me that was the only way to activate the next level of care. I had tried so many times to get help, but it wasn't until Shima said that to me that I felt brave enough to tell the doctors about the thoughts I was having. And when I did, they listened.
You help so many people. I see you do it all the time, and you help me. You saved my life. That group saved my life. Thank you. Thank you so much.
But isn't it sad? It's so sad, I think, to think about our circumstances and how we met, and that it took effectively a random stranger to be the person to advocate for you, to say, this is what you need to do, and for Shima and I to be on the phone to one another saying, we need to get her to hospital now. Why is that down to average people doing that? Because if I didn't exist, that group didn't exist, who was going to do it? And that's just so sad. Because there must be so many other women who are going to slip through the net. This is really tragic.
2 days after Shima drove me to the emergency room for that fourth and final time, I was admitted to a mother and baby unit, which is a psychiatric ward for new mothers, where their babies stay with them in hospital.
Walking onto the ward for the first time, I had a sort of dissociation with reality. This wasn't happening to me. I wasn't really here. This wasn't my life. I had my son with me. He was asleep in his pram, but because of COVID, my husband wasn't allowed onto the ward with us, so we waved goodbye to each other from behind this really thick glass as they locked the doors behind me. They showed me and my son to our room, and I remember thinking it was quite nice. It was clean, it was quiet, I could see the trees through the window. And then another woman came into the room and she ordered me to open my bags, and she snapped on these latex gloves and she started going through my belongings, holding things up and saying "What's this?" They took away my cables, my dressing gown belt, any plastic bags I had, and my scissors, my tweezers, and my razors. Anything that I might use to harm myself or my baby was confiscated.
You asked for this?
Are you gonna watch?
Afraid so. That's why there's so many fuzzy-legged women around here.
And then they left me in a room alone with my baby, and I freaked out because by this point, my greatest fear was to be left alone in a room with my son. The reason mother and baby units encourage their patients to have their child stay with them on the ward is so that they can bond while the mother's being treated. This greatly increases their chance of recovery, which is wonderful. Unfortunately, most of the patients on those wards are having very negative thoughts and feelings about their babies. So most women do freak out at this point, the way I did.
There's been some kind of mistake. I'm not supposed to be in here.
After that, a member of staff sat at the door to my room, which was wide open, by the way, and they watched me. Every 15 minutes, someone would look through your door and write down whatever you were doing, 24 hours a day. So in the middle of the night, you'd have this bright light shining on you, and they'd be like, "What's she doing?" "Oh, she's sleeping." Someone I'd never met before watching me wash, eat, talk on the phone.
Hi, my name is Sawyer Valentini. I am at Highland Creek Behavioral Health Facility. I am being held here against my will. Please, send help.
Do you know how many calls the cops get like that every week?
Those are from crazy people.
They watched it all and they wrote it all down. I immediately felt like I'd made a mistake and tried to bargain my way out. I told them I didn't need to be there, that actually going home would be the best thing for me, that I wasn't really that ill. They told me I was wrong, that I definitely needed to be there, and that if I tried to leave, they would section me under the Mental Health Act, meaning I would be detained against my will, my rights stripped away. The reality of my situation hit me then. In only a month, I had become so unwell that I was now trapped on a locked ward, trying to convince a stranger that I wasn't mad, when I knew in my heart that I was mad. And for the first time, I thought, I might never get out of here. I felt like a prisoner. We couldn't go into each other's rooms or touch each other's babies. When we were finally allowed outside, we weren't allowed to meet up with another patient. We were given our pills in one of those little paper cups. And I remember thinking, oh, this is like those little paper cups in films. And then I met the other patients. They had wild eyes, stained clothing. They shuffled around in their slippers. Some of them were crying, others glared, angry, but most of them just looked scared and lost. Now I was surrounded by witches. They looked in at me through the window. They whispered to each other outside my room. They swayed in the shadows, waiting. At dinner time, I sat down at a table, and a woman I'd never seen before came and sat down next to me.
Hi, I'm Emily.
We were soon joined by another woman.
Hi, I'm Jude.
I felt an immediate connection to Emily and Jude as they told me their stories.
I had had months of feeling progressively worse. There was one specific day I'd asked my friend, who is an A&E nurse actually, to meet me in the park, and I just said to her, I I don't recognise myself. I looked in the mirror and I don't recognise who I am. She said, I'm going to take you home now. And I really think we need to step this up, because if someone presented to me in A&E like this, I would immediately call the psychiatric team.
What do you mean you didn't recognise yourself?
I looked in the mirror and it wasn't me anymore. I saw a person, but I felt so disconnected to that person. I was terrified.
And Emily, what was happening with you?
I think pretty much as soon as my son was born, I sort of stopped sleeping, and progressively that became more and more sort of horrific. This building feeling of wanting to escape.
What sort of things were you planning? How were you going to escape?
Maybe I could get a train several hours away and hide in a hotel and not tell anyone. Really weird. And then I guess, they also then became a bit more desperate and darker, and actually, how can I sort of just literally escape?
Talking to Emily and Jude did help, but it wasn't enough. I needed to talk to people who had suffered from these illnesses and recovered. A friend gave me the phone numbers of 2 women, and from my room on the ward, I called them.
Hi, my name's Crystal. I'm an associate professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. I'm also a mum myself to a little 4-year-old boy called William.
Hi, I'm Lucy Warwick Wasp, and I am one of 2 mums to a wonderful daughter who will be 9 in a couple of weeks.
Crystal and Lucy had been on different wards a couple of years before me. Both of them were now doing well and had used their experiences in their work to help other women who found themselves in a similar place. Another person I spoke to was Sophia, who has never been in a mother and baby unit, but has had experience of postpartum depression and anxiety. She reached out to me when she heard I was in the ward and was so kind and understanding. I felt very close to her.
I'm Sophia Di Martino, and I'm an actor.
And do you have children?
Yeah, 2.
I asked these women to tell me about their experiences, hoping I could use their stories of recovery as a kind of spell book to help me find a way through the storm.
So, can you just tell me, how did your feelings of anxiety and depression, how did they first sort of manifest?
I was really loved up at the beginning after giving birth, until my husband went back to work. And when it was just me responsible for the child, things just nosedived really, really quickly.
I experienced a very long labour, so I was kind of left quite traumatised really after that. And this then kind of continued, and I do remember speaking to my GP quite early on, say, I was crying a lot. I was still probably in shock. I think what she was trying to do was ascertain whether or not I was experiencing postpartum psychosis, which I wasn't, but then everything else just kind of got missed.
Looking back, it was postnatal depression and anxiety, but it started off as like a chronic insomnia. I thought I was going to die. I remember asking the midwife, how much no sleep does it take to kill a person? Like, can you die from having no sleep? And she was like, no, of course not. Of course you can't die from having no sleep. But I think you actually probably can, because I felt my body, like, giving up.
I couldn't work anything out. I couldn't work out when I remember lining up my glasses in the morning thinking, if I put them there, then I'll remember to put them on. Everything becomes like, how do I navigate my home with a baby as well? And I couldn't quite work it out.
I had this sort of heartbreak when my second child was born, because I loved my baby so much, of course, but I realised that I couldn't be with my first child as much, just me and him. And I was just heartbroken. And the reality of being in the hospital and away from him for a few days just broke my heart.
And I was just, I was desperate to not be on my own with him. So I'd be like driving to my friends and, just at a friend's house for a few hours just so that I wouldn't be on my own, and thinking desperately how I was going to feel each day. But it just spiralled and got worse and worse and worse until I was admitted to a mother and baby unit.
The other women on the ward were all fellow sufferers of perinatal mental health issues. Some had been there for months already. Some had even given birth while they were staying on the ward. Most of them had anxiety and depression like me, but some women had psychosis.
This is Catherine Cho, the author of Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness, which details her experience of postpartum psychosis. Catherine wasn't on the ward with me, but she and her book have helped me to better understand these illnesses.
How is psychosis different to, say, anxiety or depression?
So, psychosis is a complete separation from reality. The wall between what your brain is experiencing, all the memories and the subconscious is broken. And genuinely, it felt like everything I'd ever experienced, read about, or known was being processed at the same time.
And what kind of things were you seeing during that psychosis?
Well, first it started with seeing devils in my son's eyes. That was the first indication that something was wrong. I started seeing demons. I heard the voice of God talking to me. I saw a lot of figures. I felt them as well, which is kind of terrifying. You could feel people brush past you. Food that was given to me looked like flesh, and I could see people preparing the flesh and bringing it to me. My husband's face wasn't his own. I saw, robots. I saw basically a lot of just very vivid imagery, and continually devils and demons. The nurses looked like devils to me. I could feel them kind of pulling at me, tearing at me, even though I know now that that wasn't happening. My husband took me to A&E when he realized I was not well. I thought we were in purgatory, and I could see people pushing like microphones and lights and screens and kind of laughing like, this is really funny. And I was trying to convince him that we were on a film set, that we were in purgatory, and that we needed to exit. And he was just like, let's be quiet.
Can you tell me about waking up in the psychiatric unit?
I woke up in a blank room, a white room, with no memory of what was going on. I woke up alone. This was after 4 days of psychosis, and eventually, by the time I'd been brought to the ward, I had stripped off all my clothes and I had urinated on the floor. And they left me in there to kind of wake up after sedating me. It felt like I was in a film, like that kind of moment of where am I, what had happened. And there was really nothing for me to do except to get out of the bed, put on some clothes, and step outside, which is what I did.
Catherine became unwell during a trip to America and didn't have access to a specialist mother and baby unit like I did. Instead, she was separated from her son and treated on a general adult ward.
So most of the people in the facility were homeless or veterans, people who had drug abuse issues. There were people who'd fallen through the system, essentially.
Before you became unwell, what did you know about postpartum psychosis?
I did know the very famous case in the US, Andrea Yates' case, but it wasn't until I was recovering that I realized we had the same diagnosis. I didn't know that it was postpartum psychosis.
Can you tell me a bit about Andrea Yates?
Andrea Yates, this happened, I think, in 2001. She was a woman in Texas, and she drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. She was charged with murder, and they were looking for the death penalty. But it was her husband who really stepped in, and he said he didn't blame her for what she had done. But I think the general public just didn't understand and was genuinely horrified. And she's very much a polarizing figure, I think, in the US.
There are just 2 mother and baby units in the US. In the UK, we have 22, which is in part due to the tragic death of Dr. Daksha Empson, a brilliant psychiatrist who lived only a few miles from where I gave birth.
Well, my name's Dave Empson, and I was the husband to Daksha and the father to Freya.
So prior to becoming a mother, Daksha had been diagnosed with manic depression and was on medication. How did her pregnancy affect that?
So she had to be off her lithium, her antidepressant, and her thyroxine. And we did, and we were very, very lucky because we conceived straight away, and then miscarriage. And then we got pregnant again straight away, then another miscarriage. And all this time she's off of medication, so it's almost like that time bomb's ticking away. And in the end, you know, the dream came true, and she was pregnant with Freya. And when Freya was born, I'm sure all fathers, especially, you know, first baby, what a magical experience.
Daksha was keen to breastfeed, so the couple agreed, along with her psychiatrist, that she could stay off her medication for a further 3 months.
We discussed her medication, her signs, her illness, before she got pregnant, during and afterwards, on a daily basis. But it was that last week that I realised it was 3 months now she's been breastfeeding, and she's been off her medication and had 3 miscarriages before that. So I did mention to her that, you know, it was probably time to go on medication, eh? And she didn't want to.
Daksha was suffering from postpartum psychosis, but no one around her knew. She was scared that if she told anyone, then Freya would be taken away from her. And she was afraid of being stigmatised by her colleagues if she told her psychiatrist the truth. The day Daksha and Freya died, Dave had been at work.
As I got to the front door, there was a very, very strong smell. So I got into the kitchen and Freya's pram was there, but she wasn't in the pram. There was something on the table. There was a A4 piece of paper. Picked up the note and I just read the first word. And then I knew what that smell was.
The day before Daksha killed herself and Freya, Dave had taken this photo of them.
She was brilliant at hiding her feelings. So the photograph that I took, big smiling face, she'd already planned it.
The impact of Daksha and Freya's legacy on cases like mine cannot be understated. Their story has been used internationally to emphasise the importance of perinatal mental health training.
Why is it important to you to talk about it?
I have to do this. I cannot allow my girls and other mums and babies to die in vain.
You know, what happened to Daksha was a complete and utter tragedy. And sadly, you know, I've been involved in looking at the reports from her death and from Freya's death and sort of learning lessons from her death and from Freya's death. And actually, you know, gosh, I might get quite tearful, but for her, sorry.
That really shocked the medical world when it happened, that a doctor, a very gifted doctor, took her own life. And it made it very clear to people that organise services, etc., that there is a difference between the way psychosis presents in the normal population and how it presents in the postnatal population. The condition comes on faster, presentations can change within minutes, whereas in the general population it could take weeks to months to see the same changes. It's considered a psychiatric emergency, and we don't have many of them.
As the years go on, I sort of often think what state of mind she must have been in to have been so psychotic. I don't know I have no idea what was going on in her head. No one will know. Her husband won't know, nobody will know. But to have got to that point of psychosis where that was the exit route, Whether it was through the psychosis, she thought she was saving herself and Freya, I don't know. I don't know.
It has been over 20 years since Daksha and Freya died, but what happened to them is still happening.
So in 2000, one of the factors that shocked the UK and, more globally was the fact that suicide was the leading cause of death in the pregnancy period and just afterwards. And in November last year, 2022, we had the latest triennial report, and guess what? Suicide is still a leading cause of maternal death in the UK. So nothing has changed. In fact, the awful statistic from last year is that the rates of suicide have actually gone up.
Even with the expansion of services, there are gaps in women coming through the door in the first place. You've got all these women who wouldn't even dare tell their GP or their midwife or their social worker or whoever it is that they're suffering because they're worried what might happen. One of the most common things that we get in our service is, oh, I was worried that if my GP referred to you that you'd take my baby away. I can count on one hand the number of women who have had their children removed, and I've treated thousands and thousands of women. There's a stigma around mental health, but the stigma around motherhood is huge as well. To say you're not a good mother is probably the worst insult a woman would ever hear in their life. It cuts very deep. So there's this idea that by being referred to somebody like us or someone like me, this internal idea of, am I a failure? Am I not a good mum? Etc. etc. And I think women struggle with that even before they get through the door.
Do you ever feel guilty as a mother?
I think I feel guilty as a mother a lot of the time.
The moment you find out you're pregnant, the guilt begins. And I don't think it ever stops.
There's so many pressures and so many expectations. Am I doing enough? Have I given them enough time or enough space? Am I providing for them in all the ways that I should be or could be?
Feel guilty about working, feel guilty about not working, feel guilty about spending too much time with one child and not the other child, feel guilty about not spending enough time with your children, feel guilty about not spending enough time on yourself.
And I think there's a lot of shame as well around being a mum and people not wanting to show the messy bits. And there's a lot of shame around being ill after having a child. There's a lot of shame around that.
Why do you think you were scared or you didn't tell people that you were going into the unit?
Well, it's just all that judgment. I didn't want people to think badly of me, that I'd been a failure. Yeah. And I do remember there's two other women who had babies that were same age as our daughter, and one of them had friends visit and things. I was like, God, that's brave.
Hi.
I hid from my friends. So I remember in the mother and baby unit, my friends turned up, just come to see me, nice thing, and I was just like, I can't see them because I just didn't feel like me anymore. What am I going to say to them, when they're sat there? Like, I can't make small talk because, they've come to see their friend and their friend's gone.
So that guilt and shame that you felt, which I felt, which seems to be almost universal when it comes to motherhood, where do you think that comes from?
I don't know, I wish I knew because I'd find it and I'd fucking get rid of it. I don't know. It just must be a subconscious societal thing that is drip-fed into us since being born. I don't know. Do you know?
Maybe women don't want to talk about the dark thoughts and feelings we have because we don't want to be the wicked witch. Or maybe it goes back even further, to the women who were accused as witches hundreds of years ago. The ones I read about in school, the women whose names went round and round my head.
Oh, this is heavy.
So these are testimonies of women who confessed to being witches in the 15th and 16th century.
Wow. Okay, then just read them one by one. Okay.
Anna Motes confessed within 2 hours of her arrest.
Saying the devil appeared to her when she was alone in her house, cursing her husband and children.
Mary Scrutton confessed that the devil appeared to her twice, once as a bear,
then again as a cat, and tempted Mary in a hollow voice to kill her child.
Susanna Smith confessed the day after her arrest
that 18 years previously, the devil had appeared to her in the form of a red dog and tempted her to kill her children.
Priscilla Collett confessed that the devil had appeared to her when she was 6, some 12 years previously,
and tempted her to kill her children to escape poverty. She placed one of her children next to the fire to burn it. Fortunately, another child pulled the baby away from the fire.
So that, to me, sounds like somebody developing a postpartum psychosis or a severe depression, but it certainly sounds like somebody dipping into a psychosis.
Can you relate to any of those testimonies?
I mean, I think the voices, for sure, the voices and the idea that it is a devil.
Oh, devil appears all the time in psychosis, yeah.
Where do you think that comes from?
It's really interesting. I think it's something to do with the way women start to think in that postnatal period, particularly when they're depressed or they're developing a depression and then a psychosis. They bring in either their own faith or their own religion, or I guess a more sort of global interpretation of good and evil, devils and angels.
Those witch trials were such a long time ago, and yet I can relate to so much of what the women were saying. It is chilling to realise that if I'd been alive back then, I would have been considered evil, and I would have been killed. In the 15th and 16th centuries, thousands of executions took place, usually by either hanging or burning the accused at the stake. The witch trials ripped through communities with devastating effect. In Europe and North America, around 50,000 women were killed. In 1585, 2 German villages were left with only 1 female inhabitant in each.
I'm Professor Marion Gibson, and I work at Exeter University, where I'm Professor of Renaissance and Magical Studies.
And what is it that you find interesting about witches?
I've always been interested in witches, actually. When I went to university, they gave me a kind of newspaper account of witches, of a witch trial in Elizabethan Essex. And in it, there were these voices of women that I became fascinated by, because these are women that we didn't normally hear from. You know, they weren't in the literature that I was reading. They weren't in the history books. They were ordinary women, and they were talking about their lives, and the way they were doing that was framing it through narratives of witchcraft. And I thought that was fascinating.
These atrocities were playing out against a backdrop of normal everyday life. Women in their kitchens, feeling the devil's presence as they baked bread.
The devil lives in domestic spaces, yeah, and he lives in ordinary foods, and he lives in ordinary objects, and you can use those ordinary objects to bewitch your neighbours. And I think that's one of the most frightening things about the idea of the witch. It's also ordinary, it's also mundane. Anybody could be a witch. Anything that crosses your path in the course of your day might be bewitched. And the idea that your whole world is threatening to you, your whole world is full of witchcraft and the devil, I think is a very frightening thing for people in this period.
Many of the women accused as witches were people who lived outside of the established norms, who dared to rebel. Even back then, the witch was the stereotypical opposite of the good mother, the good wife. She was the woman who was trying to act independently of male control.
Witchcraft trials are all about power and control. They're about controlling women, they're about controlling people generally. They're about telling you what to believe and making you affirm that you believe it. So they're a control mechanism.
So, a woman is accused of being a witch. What happens next?
They would have been questioned by the magistrate, and then they'd have been put in a cart and taken off to the nearest prison, and then they would have waited there in the jail conditions, which were horrible, until the criminal court was convened, and that could be months. And then they'd be brought into the court in a public setting where everybody was angry and chatting, and, you know, there's a kind of whirl of activity. Questioned by the judge very briefly, asked to say something about their situation.
I know nothing of witchcraft.
Then judged by the jury. Most trials took about 10 minutes, if that, which is astonishing, isn't it? You have absolutely no time to think. And then you're judged, and then you're taken away, and you could be hanged.
And how did they torture the women?
Torture was officially banned against witches or anybody else in England. It was reserved for state crimes, things like treason.
So those women whose testimonies I showed you, they confessed without torture?
Yes. They do seem to have confessed voluntarily. And nobody's ever really been able to explain that.
And would they have known what would happen to them if they confessed? Would they have known that they would die?
Yes, they would have seen it in their communities. So they did know. I think there's good evidence that they had quite a lot of experience of what happened to witches, particularly when you get on to, say, the Matthew Hopkins trials in the 1640s. You know, by then, witchcraft has been illegal for 80 years. There's 80 years of people being hanged for this crime. But nevertheless, people carry on confessing, which is very difficult to explain unless you think there are other factors involved.
One thing I would say from these questions, though, is, you know what I just read? Like, the way I felt if there wasn't something where, like, perinatal mental health was a thing that I knew about and I was in a Mother and Baby unit, if somebody had, I would have confessed to being a witch. If that was the social narrative, that if you think X, Y, and Z, you're a witch, I'd have confessed. I would have done it, you know. Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Because, yeah, you feel so... You're desperate for an explanation. And I think that I would have gone for that.
Yeah, and would you have also been happy dying as well?
Yeah. Yeah.
I can fully relate to that feeling of choosing to be hanged versus carrying on in a really terrible reality. It was a form of torture. To be a prisoner in your mind is a form of torture. It was not a way to live.
I would have voluntarily confessed too. But it has been 400 years. Why do women still feel like this? Why are suicide rates increasing? Why is there still so little awareness, knowledge, and support around these illnesses?
If I'd been pregnant in that time, who would have treated me?
You'd have gone to your neighbour because you knew they'd had children before, and you'd say to them, could you maybe come and look after me during my pregnancy? And then you would say to them, can you act as a midwife as well? But basically, it would be a neighbour. It would be an elderly female neighbour who had done all of this before.
Women used to be the main healers. We were doctors without degrees, learning anecdotally, passing on our knowledge to the next generation. We were the first pharmacists, abortionists, nurses and counsellors. We were midwives travelling from home to home and village to village. Medicine is part of women's heritage and history. It was once our birthright. But then everything changed.
Do you know the entire witchcraft scare? I mean, Christ, as far back as the 14th century was started by the medical profession? That's right. They were trying to get midwives out of the childbirthing business. That's what they were. Most of the women that they burned, midwives.
Is that true?
You better believe it. Just another example of male-dominated professional society exploiting females for their own selfish purposes. Men are such cocksuckers, aren't they?
He's almost right. But it wasn't just midwives. It was any women who treated their neighbours, who made medicines, who cared for others.
One of the arguments that's been put forward is that witchcraft trials were about driving out female healers. While I don't think that was a deliberate strategy, it does seem to me to be an effect of what happens. You know, if you're constantly attacking and demonising people who say they have healing skills and dragging them away and they're being executed as witches, it seems to me that does leave a kind of gap in the healing market. And that was the gap into which male medical workers stepped.
But the male doctors of this period were using very little of what we would recognise today as science. During training, they rarely saw any patients, and no experimentation of any kind was taught. Whereas the wise women, the witches, were working in the field, treating people, developing an understanding of bones and muscles, herbs and drugs. When I became ill, my only course of action was to keep returning to the emergency room, desperate for the help I wasn't receiving. I wish that instead I could have gone to the home of the local witch who had seen all of this before. But those women were stolen from us. Taken from their homes.
Bring out Elizabeth Selwyn.
They were vilified, derided, called crones and hags. Condemned for all eternity to be dismissed as old wives or spectres of doom. To scare little children and warn women to never grow old, to never behave badly.
Burn the witch!
And the eradication of their history as healers still affects medicine. Gender bias in medical knowledge, research and practice is deeply ingrained. A study from 2022 showed that women are often not taken seriously, ignored, or deemed emotional when it comes to their illnesses and pain.
Entirely natural expansion of the pelvis. You can fight it with ordinary aspirin.
I was afraid it might be an ectopic pregnancy.
Ectopic? I thought you weren't going to read books, Rosemary.
It was staring at me in the drugstore.
And all it did was worry you. Will you go home and throw it away, please?
I will.
Pains will be gone in 2 days. Ectopic pregnancy.
So I have a good friend, Rageshri Daryawan, who writes a lot about this, and we call it testimonial injustice. And that's when your truth is not taken seriously. You're not seen as a reliable narrator of your own story. And it classically happens to women, and certainly women who are racially minoritized are at the greatest risk of not being believed. And it's right across the board. So if you think about endometriosis, it's an average 8 years for a woman to be diagnosed with endometriosis. And during that time, she's likely to have sought help again and again and again, and her symptoms will have been dismissed. Pain relief. We know that black women are much less likely to be given adequate analgesia after medical procedures because of a sort of perception that they have a higher pain threshold. Me going in and saying numerous times, I'm struggling, I'm depressed, I'm clinical, and I'm telling you with my experience as a doctor that I've got severe postnatal depression, anxiety, and I need help. For that to just be minimised. We have known for years that Black and Asian women are more likely to die in childbirth. And we've done nothing about it until relatively recently. We still don't do enough about it. That's a deliberate thing, because we could solve that. We managed to raise funds to be able to find a vaccine against COVID within 12 months. So when there is political will to address a situation, we address it. There has been no political will to address ethnic disparities in health.
So my son arrived very early, and I also had an infection. But I was told, don't worry, and it would all go away. But actually it didn't go away. I gradually, over the next sort of 48 hours, became more and more delirious. I remember walking through the kitchen and seeing loads of shiny knives and having a thought back to Daksha Empson, thinking, God, God, is that what went through Daksh's mind? And I immediately was so terrified by that thought, so terrified, even though I wasn't in a dark space at that point. But I remember being so terrified that I ran out of my kitchen as quickly as I could. I knew something was wrong with me, but I didn't quite know what it was. And then eventually, I collapsed.
At the hospital, Trudy struggled to make the other doctors understand what was happening to her.
Because I said, you know, I'm a perinatal psychiatrist, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was unwell. So they didn't believe me. And then my husband had to say to them, no, it's true. No, she really is. She really is a perinatal. That is exactly what she does.
Were you able to look at yourself from the outside at any point? Be like,
Constantly. Yeah. In a way, I was being my own psychiatrist, looking at what all the causes might be and what all the treatments might be. But I could also see it from all the thousands of counts of stories I've had from women over time.
And have you ever talked about this in public before?
No. I've never, ever, ever spoken about this publicly before, no.
Why haven't you?
I think you have to be ready to tell your own story, actually, at the right time, to the right people. Even being a perinatal psychiatrist, it took me years to accept that it had also been a full-blown psychosis, or that it had dipped into a psychosis. And that stigma.
I don't think I've been open at work about the severity of my mental health issues. In fact, I don't think anyone at work knows. My entire career has been focused on challenging stigma around HIV in particular. But then when it comes to mental health, I still feel like there's still an element of shame within me about that, like somehow I failed. My brain or my mind wasn't strong enough to cope with this, so this is my fault.
Executing women as witches was a way of cleansing communities of women who were mentally unwell, who didn't fit in, or who knew too much and had too much power. And their murders still reverberate throughout our society. Women are scared of being judged, scared to talk about our dark thoughts, our rage, our madness.
I think the witch trials do leave a tremendous legacy of guilt and shame and silence, the silencing of women's voices, the silencing of women's experiences. It may all seem a very long time ago, but it's so persistent. You know, I've looked back at witch trials over 7 centuries, and I can't help thinking that we see the same thing again and again and again. And as a female historian, that really resonates with me. You know, I feel those emotions the same as those women did in history. And I think that's really powerful. I think we should be telling this story. The witch trials leave behind them this tremendous legacy of women feeling they can't talk about things that happen to them, of women feeling things are their fault, of women feeling disempowered and that they are the enemy somehow in society. The whole thing is just this enormous ball of guilt and shame and misery and difficulty and horror and anxiety, isn't it? Oh God, I'm wrong. It's that, isn't it? We all feel it. Yeah.
After a month on the ward, I gradually, magically, did start to get better. I spent more time with Emily and Jude, finding sisterhood and understanding amidst the darkness.
We ate all our meals together. We would sit at the doorways to each other's room, chatting. Before lights out in the evening, we'd slump on these sofas and compare symptoms. We became like a strange sort of family, a coven, holding each other when it all got too much.
My son and the other babies became part of our coven too. I spent my days just holding him, and gradually I started taking him out of the ward on my own. I was no longer scared of him. I began to understand him and what he needed. Then one day I was finally able to close the door to my room so that he and I were alone together. I was so relieved that I could do it, that he was finally safe. I was finally safe.
Being released from a psychiatric ward is as weird as going into one. They don't wait until you're 100% better. Will you ever be 100% better? Will any of us? Anyway, they don't wait until you're 100% better. But instead, they wait until they know that you can cope with being at home. And it's very gradual. So I started going home for the afternoon. And then I would go home for the whole day. And then overnight. After one of my overnights, Emily told me that she'd heard a nurse saying that they thought I would be going home for good soon. And I was really scared because I didn't think I was ready. The staff told me to try going home for the weekend.
Oh, fine. Thanks. Right over there.
My husband, Jeremy, came and picked us up. And he'd bought all my favourite food. And he was just trying so hard to make it really nice and comfortable. And I was really touched, but I remember also feeling really scared that I wouldn't be able to do it, that I wouldn't be able to cope, and that I would let him down. But then the next morning, I woke up and everything was okay. And I just remember crying with relief. Because I knew that whatever happened, we'd got through this. The darkness had lifted.
I think the time when we couldn't stop laughing, that first time when we laughed, like proper belly laughing, we were crying laughing, I was like, oh, I can feel again. I don't feel like I'm behind a glass wall.
Just getting like a hug from another woman, like a long hug. Like you're a kid, like you're a little girl. Just having someone hug you and be like, you're gonna be okay. You're gonna get through this and you're gonna be okay. And just like hold you, because you're doing all the holding when you become a mother. You're doing so much holding. Having someone hold you and just, I'm so lucky to have my mum just do that for me.
In what ways do you feel like your illness and that experience changed you?
It was absolutely my lowest I've ever been. And I've had some lows. And it was absolutely the lowest I've ever been. And I kind of climbed back from it. So in a way, I do feel that nothing we face as a family is probably ever going to be as bad in my mind as what we went through.
Yeah, I think I am more grateful now for small things and for my family and for moments, and kind of I feel so lucky to have had the help and to have got better and had some amazing times with my family. With my family.
Before I had kids, I always used to think, why would you have mum friends? I won't have mum friends. I'll just keep my own friends. I don't need new friends. Oh, it'll be so boring. And then I had children, and then I had a breakdown. And I really, really needed that community. I needed to be wrapped up in the love and the care of other women. It does feel like a coven, doesn't it? This sort of collective wisdom, knowledge, experience, sharing, support.
What would you say to a woman who's watching this, who is maybe going through a perinatal mental health crisis? What advice would you give her?
Never, ever, ever struggle in silence. There is always help for every type of perinatal mental health crisis or psychological crisis. Tell everybody around you, tell your partner, tell your family, tell your friends, but most importantly, go and get professional help. And no one's going to take your baby away.
I always wanted to be a witch. A good witch. One who only used her power gently. But now I know that good witches are prisoners too. They have to suppress their power.
You know, I lighted it with a match, Wally. From now on, I'm going to be just a simple, helpful wife.
Or give it up. They must stay young and beautiful. They cannot stray from the path. I see now that their magic is meaningless, nothing more than a trick.
Thank you.
I would much rather be a bad witch. My mental health is now stable, although I've been told I should probably stay on medication for the rest of my life. I see the world in a different way now. How fragile our minds are, how easily our reality can be shattered. I know now that not everything is as it seems. I've thought a lot about how to talk to my son about what happened to us. About how he was pulled into my darkness, my madness, my horror. I don't want him to feel bad about that.
My son is 2.5 now, and I'm completely obsessed with him. It's my favorite person in the whole world. And while there are a lot of people to thank for my recovery, it was my son who saved my life. He gave me love and focus and a reason to keep going. And he was there with me every day on the ward. And I now treasure that one-on-one time we had together.
In your life, you too will find that your sense of reality shifts. You will be pulled into worlds so horrible you cannot even begin to process them. Rooms that make your knees weak. Madness and darkness, horror and pain are always here waiting. They will come for us all. But then so will joy, beauty, love, and magic. Every woman is a witch, and every witch needs a coven.
Now, what do you want to ask me?
All right, thank you. Can we cut?
Betty, can you see the camera? Where's the camera?
The camera down there.
Okay.
You say hello.
You wave to the camera. Hello. You wave hello to the people in the camera.
Hello. You say thank you.
Thank you.
you.